Hey, everybody. Dave the Klone back again for another installment of the 15 minutes of movie memory madness. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you have your water cooler cups filled, or at least a damn fine cup of coffee. And before we go any further, remember to smash the subscribe and like buttons and click the bell icon to stay apprised of when new content comes to this channel and arrives. Oh my god, I can't believe I have to say this crap in every episode, but welcome to the world we're in now. Which I think is a great jumping off point for today's episode because, you know, in trying to make sure that this isn't just your, average everyday movie review podcast, it's really, I think the focus, it was funny, a friend of mine asked me, like, well, what's the deal with this show? Like, what is different about it than anything you've done before? And it's really, the movie is really kind of just a jumping off point to talk about the nostalgia around the movie. And I think for a lot of us movie aficionados out there, and please feel free to comment on the post here or email me at hollow9podcast@gmail.com to let me know your thoughts on this. And I think it's a subconscious thing that a lot of the time, some of the reasons we really like a movie will change because maybe there was something in the moment. It's almost like the same effect as it when you're in the store and you're trying on clothes and you're like, oh man, I mean, I don't know if people still do this in the post-COVID world here, but you used to go shopping and you'd try something on and you'd be like, okay, yeah, that looks kind of cool. I think I'll take this. And then you get it home and maybe you don't have occasion to wear it, and then all of a sudden the day you go to put it on, you're like, why the hell doesn't this look as good as I thought it did? and it's because maybe there was something going on. Maybe like the song that was playing in the store was kind of, grooving and you were sort of in a good zone because of that, or maybe you had just had your first date with some new person and you were feeling really good and on top of the world, and that framed this leather jacket looking much cooler than it does now. But I think sometimes the same thing happens with movies, and sometimes we really love a movie because of all these sort of circumstances that might have surrounded it the first time we watched it. And then as time goes on, I mean, obviously some movies just stand out and are awesome, and nothing that could be happening around it coinciding with you watching it could really change that. And then sometimes you saw a movie and it was just a lot of fun. You were with some fun friends in the theater, and then you go to watch it by yourself and you're like, this sucks. I don't know what the hell was going on. I don't know what I was thinking. That is not going to be the case with today's movie. You never know which way it's going to go after a setup like that. But I think today I'm going to talk about The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, because that's sort of a more on the modern side of things. That movie came out when I was a senior in college, so it's a little bit of a closer in time memory. It's not necessarily from the 80s, 90s. It does sort of tie back to childhood because there were the cartoon versions of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that I used to love apparently when I was really little. I don't remember them at all, and even once the popularity of Lord of the Rings became a huge cultural phenomenon with the Peter Jackson films, even then it was sort of like when I would look at the cover and people would be like, oh, don't you remember watching these cartoons when you were a kid? No, I don't. It was way before I was retaining things or understanding things. I mean, it's interesting when you think about if you grew up and movies were a big part of your life from the time you were a little kid. There were definitely times before we comprehended movies, and I see this a lot with my nephews. They're 9 now, but I've been watching movies with them for the last 5-6 years where they don't understand fully what's going on, but maybe they like the colors on the screen, or there's a really cool action sequence, or something catches their eye. And now they ask questions and they talk about, well, why is that character doing this if he's in love with the other one? Or which one of these is the bad guy? I don't understand. And I remember a point where I was watching Star Wars: A New Hope, and I was like, I totally get it now. I'm picking up what the subtext is, and I understand what they're referencing things that we haven't seen yet that we're going to see in the movies coming down the road in the future, thinking they were going to be good. And, I think Star Wars makes sense to think of when you think of Lord of the Rings as well, because Lord of the Rings, for the most part, was very much Peter Jackson's kind of holy trilogy, Trinity, a little bit of both. Holy trilogy of films. I think there was even I don't know if it was the History Channel that did it, maybe it was the Sci-Fi Channel did like this kind of round table. It wasn't a round table, it was more of like a featurette talking to a bunch of different filmmakers. And Peter Jackson even said, well, you look at Star Wars, the original trilogy, and you start to think, well, what could I do that would be on that level? And, The Lord of the Rings was kind of sitting there as this incredible property. Now, I hadn't read any of the books until I saw the first movie, but once I saw the first movie, you're like, all right, well, one, I want to know what the hell is going on in the rest of these, because I actually have to admit, going into Fellowship of the Ring, I went to the movies by myself. There was a period of time where I really enjoyed doing that. And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think there's something kind of cool about taking the experience of going to the theater, which is supposed to be a little bit of a social experience, right? I mean, there's the way the seats are. You could wind up, if you went to a movie on opening weekend or something, and it was like a hugely anticipated blockbuster, you could be packed in there like sardines, sitting right up against a complete friggin' stranger. And it would not necessarily, I don't think, affect your viewing experience, but there's something to be said for going there by yourself and not having the buffer on either side of you of friends or family or somebody you know. But in any case, I went into this movie very little knowledge. I don't think I'd even really seen a trailer. Maybe I'd been seeing the posters and going, oh, I wonder what the hell this is, but it looks really good. And then you would see the list of names of the actors and you're like, oh man, that's going to be really cool. Let me check this out. So it was sort of on a whim. It was definitely during a time where I was still indulging in smoking a lot of pot. So it was one of these movies where once I saw that the runtime was close to 3 hours, I think it was a 2 hour and 50 minute or 2 hour 45 minute in the theatrical, the original cut. Since then, we've had an extended version released on DVD, and now if you are a Max subscriber, the artist formerly known as HBO Max, you can watch the extended versions of all three of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But today we'll talk about what it was like going to see the first one, and maybe this will become a series talking about all of them, because the first one was a solo mission. I made sure to bring plenty of herbal enhancements to sit outside the theater and get really, really, really baked before I went in. And I'm trying to think, I believe at the time I went to the newer, where I grew up in North Jersey, where I was living at the time in North Jersey, and I was home visiting from college, because I definitely wound up seeing this movie 3 or 4 times in the theaters with different friends and groups, and 2 of them were when I was back in college. And I went to the movie theater. There was a newer theater that opened up in one of the shopping malls in Paramus, the AMC Theater over in the Garden State Plaza. Beautiful big theater, stadium seating, and this is pre-lounge chair recliner, hoping you fall asleep in the movie seats that we have now. And I was always notorious for making sure to bring in my own snacks, because who of us really understand the business model where the theaters are only making, I don't know, X percentage of the ticket sales, and so the only way that they make their money is in the concessions. And it's almost like going to the airport, right? They kind of got you by the short ones, and you're sitting there going, oh man, a hot dog is $10. You know what I mean? It wasn't always like that, and there were times that you would like to get like a big box of snacks and go. I would always still buy some candy. I think the chocolate candies at the movie theater were sort of a gold standard of better than your average fare that you would get, although now you can get snow caps anywhere. But yes, snow caps were my sort of go-to. But I got really baked. I had brought, I think, a bagel sandwich with me, because I went early. I got up early and went to a matinee thinking, well, at least I'll still have the rest of the day after this to do stuff. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know, really what the vibe was going to be. And I got to tell you, when it comes to openings, the first Lord of the Rings film, I mean, it's epic from the gate, and even starting with this kind of, you've got voiceover in whispers in a totally weird language, and I guess it's Elvish. And then you have Cate Blanchett coming in, and I think she's supposed to be translating what they're saying, even though she's an elf, so she could speak both. And, this whole, the world is changing, and you're like, oh. It was also, I'm trying to think, it's post 9/11, right? So... yeah, it was after 9/11 had happened. I definitely know Two Towers was, because there was this whole controversy of, I think there's like this contingent of people out in the world who are just like looking to start shit over any and every little thing they can. And when the Two Towers came out, even though the movie is a direct translation of a pre-existing novel, a classic novel, part of a classic trilogy of novels that has been around for a long time, you actually had these mentally devoid lunatics petitioning to change the title of the Two Towers because it's directly referencing 9/11. And you're just like, it was the beginning of the end. Who the hell knew back then that this was going to be the beginning of the I'm offended on behalf of everybody in the world fucking crowd. So even a masterpiece like the Lord of the Rings trilogy was not immune to being pulled into controversies that had literally nothing to do with them. But, we go from this sort of the world is changing and we're getting this backstory. And at first it's kind of a little bit slow creeping in. We're getting sweeping landscape shots. We're getting shots of forests. And they're talking about, like, a change in the air. And so this kind of presence is watching us. And then they go through the story of the Rings of Power. And you've got, like, the 3 rings going to the Elves, the 6 going to the Dwarf Lords, and 9 rings going to the realms of men. But they were all of them deceived. And you're like, holy crap. Now imagine going into this blazed out of your mind and kind of not knowing what to get. And you're like, oh shit, we're talking world building from minute 1 and done in a way only a master craftsman can do. Almost like the Sauron of filmmaking. You know what I mean? Like, knew how to just draw you in. And then you have this epic battle scene. So I know one of the things that was interesting, we tried showing Lord of the Rings to my nephews, I think maybe over the summer. So they had just turned 9. And my one nephew, Leo, when I even mentioned Lord of the Rings, he's like, I heard those movies boring. It's just boring. It's just long people walking around and talking. And I'm like, are you kidding me? And I was like, dude, there's an epic war within the first 10 minutes of the movie. And that, not expecting to see what we saw. And this was another, in the same way as Star Wars, a movie that was suddenly creating a whole new level of expectation of what movies could be when CG was used very what's the word I'm thinking of? CGI is used not to completely replace the need for craft, not to completely replace the need for strategy and performance, but to enhance and to bring to life these fantastical worlds that you used to only be able to see in comic books or only used to be able to read, and you'd have to use your imagination reading a novel to kind of create the movie. The same way Jaws would have been lame if you saw it from the beginning of the movie, but your imagination created the monster Jaws until we saw it. The same thing, that's the Hitchcockian, let the imagination do the work. Well, Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, you're making an epic movie. You can't really say, oh yeah, you'll imagine thousands of soldiers standing from the first one right in front of the camera going half a mile down the field from you. So they were able to really use the CG to give you the sense of scale and scope. And that first sort of the lines charging each other and the elves are just standing there waiting for the orcs, and then it's just like like sword, and it's like literally the same. It actually almost looks like the same actor doing the same motion, but you just see it's almost like dominoes, the sword blades all coming up and cutting down that first line of orcs. I remember sitting there in the theater, bagel sandwich in hand, and I couldn't even take a bite because my jaw was just open in awe of what I was seeing. It was like, this has already kicked Braveheart's ass, and it's like we're only 2 minutes into the movie, and I'm like, we're gonna get 3 hours of this? This is friggin' awesome. And that opening battle, from that point on, I was like, this movie really can't do anything wrong. And it does admittedly slow down quite a bit after that for the next half hour, because now we're introducing our characters, we're meeting Bilbo, we're meeting the Frodo, we're meeting Gandalf, and that's where you also start to see the forced perspective. So it's like we have CG being used to give you grand and epic sweeping battle scenes. But it still required the same sort of shot planning, a traditional shooting, and so it's definitely, it's the kind of thing that you're thinking, okay, they took their time to make this. Who knows how long they were working on this for? And that's the kind of podcast this is, folks. We're not talking about I'm going to be sitting here Googling the shit to tell you, it took them 5 years to make that. No. But what you did know is that by the time the first movie was out, I think all 3 films had been shot. So at the very least, they were all filmed. And I think they were still working the CG on the second and third, and they're still doing post on the second and third. And it's not just the CG. I mean, when you see what they were able to do, where you have actors that we know all to be normal human-sized actors, and then the Hobbits are like half the size of people, and you have Elijah Wood standing next to Ian McKellen, and they look like the size is appropriate for the character, but it still looks real. You're just like, I mean, my brain is being tricked. It was very much, I used to call it brain candy, like Kids in the Hall, brain candy. It was like, and I was telling everybody, I was trying to tell people who even weren't fans of epic fantasy adventure-y type movies, that I'm like, just for the technical achievement that this movie was, it's the discipline with which they use the CG and the sort of distinct, specific things they were going for with it. And then there were just things that were kind of like really cool fantasy elements. Like I think about, I was starting to kind of wonder as we got through the beginning, although, Gandalf setting off the fireworks at the party, and the Hobbits, everybody getting high, which I thought was really funny. Like, but you have this old wizard and these like sort of little people, and everybody loves smoking weed. It really kind of validated me as a pothead at the time. I kind of felt like, I'm baked too. This is amazing, and watching, Bilbo blow smoke rings, and then Gandalf blows smoke that he kind of like does some kind of mental cheek thing, and the smoke becomes a ship, like a pirate ship with multiple masts and multiple sails, and it sails through Bilbo's smoke ring, and he goes, Gandalf, my friend, this shall be a night to remember. And you're like, dude, this fucking movie. Oh my god. And then we get fireworks, and then we're introduced to more hobbits. And then the adventure starts, the adventure begins, but even still, there's like this moment where Bilbo finally had to give the ring up. Gandalf becomes all big and dark, and when Gandalf touches the ring and sees the flaming eye and goes off to do the research, and he has this quick kind of history dump of, this is the lost ring of power. The adventure was always there. So this whole idea of it being slow, it's just that it wasn't epic battle scenes every 5 minutes. They really did things in a really great pacing. So the point by the end, 3 hours later, I think one of the things I was trying to get to is the ring wraiths at first. When you have the hobbits all kind of hiding under that root, and the ring wraith is on the road above them, and his hand is on the top of the root, and they're under the tree root in this kind of little alcove, and as he's kind of sniffing the wind looking for the ring, and all these like centipedes and creatures start coming up out of the dirt, stuff like that. You're like, this is magic on the level of the Force in Star Wars. And so even in times where they were kind of getting the exposition out of the way and getting these guys on the road, there was still enough. And I mean, yeah, sorry, I was stoned, so I'm sure there was an extra element of just being like, oh my god, this is amazing, from being herbally enhanced. But even still, you know, watching it now to this day, as I'm closing in, I'm like 39 days away from being a year sober here, so it still holds up. You know, I watched it the other day while I was doing some work, and I found myself more often than not drifting away from work and looking at the screen and still just being fascinated by the story itself and what you're seeing on the screen. After the first movie ends, I remember sitting there going, I would gladly sit through another 3 hours right now just to see what happens next, because it was brilliant. The cliffhanger that they leave you on with each of the first two films is at the level of after Luke getting his hand cut off and Han being frozen, and then all of a sudden Empire Strikes Back just ends, and you're like, you cannot leave it there. You know what I mean? At least with the first Star Wars movie, you have that awards ceremony at the end. They blow up the Death Star. There's a lot of closure for it to be a self-contained in case they didn't get to make any more movie. Well, not so much at all with the first Lord of the Rings, and there was sort of the only saving grace of being able to survive that was knowing that the others were already shot. They have a release schedule of like the next one's going to be out next year. That sucked though, knowing you had to wait. That was almost as bad as having to wait between seasons of Lost. You know, it was like, fuck, a year? But during that year, not only did the movie come out on DVD so that you were able to rent it, and you know, back when we still had video rental stores, or purchase it, I think they also announced that there would be extended versions of each of these movies, or maybe it was on Amazon when I went to go look at it, and it was like, okay, the movie's available, but you know, sometimes they wouldn't tell you these things were coming, but you would go to Amazon and the list of things that would come up when you search for it was like, okay, here's the DVD, and it says theatrical, and you're like, uh-oh, what does that mean? Because anybody who's been collecting DVDs up until that point knew, oh, all right, hold on, if they're making the distinction between theatrical and non-theatrical, that means there's going to be a director's cut. And then all of a sudden you see this kind of storybook packaging, like almost like a leather-bound book, and it's like, yep, there's going to be these extended versions that feature the first movie. It featured 25 minutes of additional footage, and it wasn't just like one or two big scenes put back in. It's like 3 minutes here, 4 minutes there, an extra, 2 more minutes on this, an extra shot of this. And it really, especially too, because right after the first movie I went and I bought, they had the Lord of the Rings trilogy all in one big book, well, paperback, and I devoured the first one real quick. It was a little bit easier because the movie provided at least the picture for my mind, and which is something I usually decry. I think it's always interesting and more interesting to read a book and be able to kind of create your own versions of the character, and then, if you're lucky enough to read a book before they announce that there's a movie coming out, you get to create the characters yourself. But sometimes when they announce the movie, you get to see the different actors they've already picked, and so then you can't help but picture those people in those roles. Now, for me, that had a really cool effect when I read American Gods, Neil Gaiman's American Gods, because I only knew Ian McShane was going to be in the show. I didn't know who else was going to be playing any of the other parts, and so I kind of created my versions of those characters as I was reading it, but then had Wednesday as Ian McShane. Unfortunately, with Lord of the Rings, having not ever had occasion to be interested to read the books before that, all of the characters that I was picturing when I was reading the book were the characters from the movie, but that also helped me because it's a very difficult read. And there are things, even with the extended version of the movie, there are things that were in the book that didn't make it. And I'm not sure why. There's, epically and famously, they left out a character named Tom Bombadil, who has, I think, a whole 30 pages of them hanging out at his sort of farm for a little while. And he lives on his own little secluded part of land. I think it's within the Shire, but he's the only person in the entire Tolkien universe, from what I've read and what I understand so far, that the Ring of Power doesn't affect him. Like, you could put it on, take it off, nothing happens. All the other normies, when they put on the Ring of Power, they go invisible, but they actually get immediately transported to kind of like the Shadow Realm, and the all-seeing flaming eye of Sauron can kind of home in on where they are, because that's sort of where the realm of this, like, it's sort of like an ether realm where he exists more as a spirit than as a corporeal form. And that's the whole, they sort of gloss over that. If there was one thing I had to kind of complain about from a story perspective or from an audience perspective, they kind of gloss over this idea that hey, stop eating that. The dog, yeah. Don't eat the ring, Sauron. That he was able to pour his essence into this ring of power. I mean, I guess, all right, we're talking about a world of mythical creatures and elves and dwarves and hobbits, but, the idea that, like, how does that happen? How does somebody put their life force or essence into an object? And that when he was defeated almost by accident in that opening battle sequence where it was humans and elves, kind of made a last stand for the free peoples of Middle-earth to try to stop Sauron in his tracks, and the ring was cut from his hand, and it's like, so once the ring was separated from him, he disintegrated into sort of non-physical being, and the ring was like sort of the last elements of him and his whole sort of presence in our realm of the realm of the living. And that's why he needs the ring back to be able to kind of retake his original form. That's sort of and again, in a sword, sandals, and wizards kind of environment here, it's kind of an interesting complaint to have. But I just felt like that was a bit of a MacGuffin. Like, well, how? But at the same time, you see what the ring does to other people, how it corrupts them, and that's really, you would hear, like, if you were holding the ring or touching the ring, or if the ring itself could tempt you to put it on, and once it starts doing that, it's almost like you become a heroin addict with it. Like, we see Frodo over the course of the 3 movies become more and more deteriorated, and I mean Gollum, the whole character of Gollum, who is transformed into the creature he is because of his time spent with the ring. It's that's the one thing where I'm kind of like, well, the sort of logical side of my brain needs just a little bit more explanation on that. But in any case, The Lord of the Rings now has this sort of place in my heart where every time we get closer to the holidays, I find myself wanting to kind of do a run through for, the next 3 or 4 or 5 years after the first movie came out. It was sort of Lord of the Rings fever. Every movie had a video game that came out that was sort of a translation of that installment of the trilogy, and you would play through, and all of them had that sort of action RPG feel to it, where you're playing through and you're starting out at baseline, and as whichever characters you chose, I mean, it was like you could choose Aragorn, you could choose Legolas, or you could choose Gimli. There were all kinds of things to earn, special abilities, enhancements to your fighting ability, and to their credit, I think it was Electronic Arts, EA, more known for the sports games, but they did have a whole division of really cool, fun action games too. They did a great job of bringing you into that world and letting you feel like you were playing through the adventures of each film. I distinctly remember playing the first one at my buddy Chris's house when it came out, and we were all, my circle of friends, we were all fully on board. That's why I saw the movie a couple times in the theater. So I went by myself, went again with Chris, went back to college, went on a date with this chick Andy. It was very cool, and it was funny. She pulled a fast one on me because she had read the books. Like, she and her mom were very big fans, and when the toys started coming out, they bought all the toys, and she recreated the sequence of the ring wraiths chasing after Arwen on her mantelpiece at her fireplace. This was probably one of the reasons I was sort of attracted to her, in addition to her being sexy as hell and cool and one of the theater people. But we went to see the movie, and after the movie was over, I was like, man, I can't believe it. Every time I watch it, I just think, I want another 3 hours right now. I got to see what happens. And she goes, well, Strider dies, right? And I was like, why would you tell me that? And I just assumed, like, well, that's got to happen in the third movie, so at least I know I have a whole nother movie to go before that happens. But that was, I thought, an interesting, because then after, by the time the third movie came out, college was over, and she went back to, she lives in Maryland, I lived in New Jersey, so it wasn't like we were able to go see the third movie together. But when I went to see the third movie and he wound up not dying, spoiler alert, I was like, what the fuck? And so I immediately got on AOL and was like, hey, what the hell was that? And she goes, oh, I just thought it would be fun to kind of set you up for that because, you were sort of staunchly hadn't read the book and weren't sure if you were going to read the book. And so I think that might have even been part of the reason why I felt like I needed to read the books. And so I got through the first book and halfway through the second and was like, ugh, this book is hard to read. There's a lot of Elvish, there's a lot of translating, there's a lot of songs. Like the music was a big thing. And I did like that they restored some of that in all of the extended versions. I don't know, it just had such this ethereal, otherworldly sort of quality to it. And because of all these things, like the video games coming out, we were getting the video games for Christmas. And then we would have game parties. It just felt like it had a life and a presence. And it was really sad once the third movie came out when that came to an end. But so here we are again, crossing the 30-minute mark. I'm probably going to have to change the name of this podcast, but 15 minutes of movie memory madness just flows so much better than half an hour of movie memory madness. We shall see. It's also when it's a bigger movie, there's a lot more to talk about. But in any case, thanks for checking in. I hope you're having fun talking about movies and jump into the conversation. Put up some comments of what you remember about when Lord of the Rings came out and seeing it for the first time. You can either comment, you can email at hollow9podcast@gmail.com. But what you can definitely do is make sure that you come back for the next installment of 15 minutes of movie memory madness. I'm Dave the Klone, and I shall see you at the movies.
You've been listening to the Hollow9ine Network, bringing you the very best in fan-made media. That's the word hollow, the number 9, I-N-E. Find the Hollow9ine Network on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat. Rate and review us on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. Email us at hollow9podcast@gmail.com. Leave us your feedback. Join in the conversation and be a part of the action. Join in the fun. Hollow9ine.